After review,
Government-side casing is very simple. We believe that if you are a doctor and what you are saying to people is the credibility of your advice, it's only worth it that if you follow your own advice at the end of the day. I want to talk to you about two levels of arguments in my speech. Firstly, I want to talk to you about the obligation of why you should follow something that you are making profit of. And second, I want to talk to you about the possible impacts that our proposal are going to bring to the table. Before that, I need to have a brief model that what we are talking about, and just to clear up if there's going to be any confusions for the opposition side. Firstly, we are only talking about instances and that there are medical consensus that there is a lifestyle that's been commonly acceptable among people. The moment that there are medical consensus, for example, if there is no medical consensus over you, like for example, drinking 1 glass of wine a day, there is no consensus over the harms that's going to be inflicted to you. That means that we are not going to punish you and publicly shame you just because you had 1 glass of wine every day. But on the other side, if you are a drinker and you are an alcohol addict and you overdrink and you just don't follow your advice, or you oversmoke and you do all the other lifestyle choices, you make all the other lifestyle choices that are widely unacceptable, then only we would censure you in public. Sit down, please. Let's look at the first argument in this view, right? We think that the doctor has an obligation to follow his own advice, specifically in a scenario that they make profit out of it. First level of analysis. We need to understand, what do doctors actually do? They sell the credibility of an advice at the end of it. And the most important thing when it comes to a doctor-patient or a doctor-consumer in this particular instance is about the trust that exists between them. The trust that the consumer has towards the credibility of the advice that the doctor is selling to him. And the moment that we think that the whole profession is relying on that trust, we need to try to build on that trust and make sure that the trust exists more at the end of it. Why is that important? Because the moment that you are a patient and you go to a doctor, it's safe for us to assume that you make that presumption that the doctor actually believes in the advice that he's giving you, and the doctor actually fundamentally follows and thinks that's the right thing to do. We think it's hypocritical for a doctor to not to do something that he's asking you to do, and not to do something that he fundamentally believes is the right thing to do at the end of the day. If as a doctor you're so certain that that's the right thing to do, why you shouldn't follow it at the end of the day? There are a couple of good examples. For example, if you are a doctor and you smoke cigarettes, it's going to be less believable and less persuasive to your patient when you ask him to not to smoke further, because you do not follow your own advice at the end of it. Before I go through the second level of analysis of my first level, I take your PR.
Consultation time frame is between 5 to 10 minutes. Within that time frame, how would I, as a patient, be able to know the lifestyle of my doctor?
We are talking. Okay, see. You cannot just base your case based on a 5 to 10 minutes. Whether in an instance that you are a publicly known doctor and then you choose to have a wrong lifestyle. But we think that's where the debate is about. That's where people know about your lifestyle. For example, your father is a doctor, your friends are a doctor, they fucking smoke marijuana with you every day, and just because they are doctors, you follow their advice and you do the same thing. There are other instances that debate can happen. More importantly, we think when it comes to consumer rights, it's very important, specifically in this scenario. Because as a patient, you trust the person. But CVD is more important because you're at a vulnerable point at a time that you cannot take care of yourself. That's why you need to have a good right to come up with an accurate evaluation of the credibility of the credibility of a trust and the advice that you're receiving at the end of the day. We don't think it's right for a doctor to be hypocritical and hence lie to the consumer, ladies and gentlemen, to make that advice not credible in the entire profession. We think that's the wrong thing to do. Secondly, this nicely leads me to my second level of argument. We think the moment as a doctor that you do not follow medical practices, you are not just going against your own or your own lifestyle, you're going against the medical pillars and principles that have been approved and they've been practiced by everyone at the end of the day. As a result of your actions, now not just you are being distributed, all the other doctors are going to be distributed and they're going to be affected at the end of the day. When the profession has to bear the consequences of your lifestyle choices, we think it's fair to give a chance to that particular profession to react and to come and punish those particular individual. In this case, is as a form of public shaming or like whatever else that they want to do. Second part of this debate, we need to understand the possible impacts that's going to have at the end of the day. As I have already mentioned to you in my analysis that I have had, we think you being doctor and the profession that you have, and you are being respected for that, the sort of practices that you would do, it might possibly lead to normalization of that particular lifestyle. For instance, if a doctor smokes, it's going to be easier for the patient to smoke at the end of the day. Specifically, we are talking about instances that in short term, they are severely hard for you to follow. For example, if a doctor asks you to exercise and he's an obese himself, then it's less likely for the patient to do that. And obesity and not exercising is going to be something hard to do. So the patient would say that, see, you are a doctor, you have been educated for 8 years about not being an obese, but that was not convincing enough for you to go to fucking gym and sign up and like go do the exercise 3 times a day, the week. And now with this 5 and 10 minutes of consultation that they want to brought up, you want to convince me and not to do it. We think this normalization of bad lifestyle is something inherently wrong, is something inherently bad, and we should oppose that at the end of it. Second level of impact. We think there are good doctors with good intentions. We think doctors, like any other people inside the society, they use excuses to smoke. For example, they say that I'm a doctor, I have to work like 12 hours, 14 hours a day, I have a stressful life, and that's why I smoke, I don't take care of myself. We think these doctors, they might possibly need a wake-up call. But we need to tell them and inform them that as a profession, as a professional, you owe this to your profession, to take care of yourself and to be a proper individual. Because those wrong choices that now you're basically just reluctant to make are actually coming at the cost of your profession. It's coming at the cost of your colleagues and other individuals to be affected at the end of the day. What have I told you in my primary speech? Firstly, I talked to you about the principle of why a doctor is obliged to follow its own advice. It's for the sake of the profession, it's for the sake of the consumer. I talked to you about the consumer rights. More importantly, I talked to you about the impacts of a doctor not following these lifestyles. We are very proud to propose.
Side opposition stance to this debate is very simple. For side government to win to this debate, they have to show to us that the actions of these doctors leading these unhealthy lifestyles would directly affect the outcome of what the patients are going to get, directly detrimentally affect the outcome of the treatment that they prescribe towards the patients. Because from so on and so forth, everything that they have said so far on side government that Barrett told you about is on the perception of the patients towards the doctors. That means these are very arbitrary perceptions that each individual might differ. That means Barrett may think that his doctor shouldn't smoke, but to the rest of us on side opposition, it might not matter. Therefore, you have to understand that this form of perception is very individual basis, and we don't believe that it's fair for side government to impose a blanket policy on every single medical doctor that affects their personal lifestyles, which they did not, by the way, sign up for when they become doctors to the end. Stance from us is very simple, right? We believe that the burden obligation of the doctor is extends so on as to treat you for your immediate treatments and to provide you and educate you on the healthy lifestyle that you choose. But after that, whatever choice that a patient wants to make is up to his own discretion and is beyond the scope of what doctors can do to actually influence that. Before I move on to give you my 2 points, number one, on the duty of obligation of doctors and medical practitioners, directly clashing what Barrett said, and secondly, on also how it affects the equilibrium allocation in the healthcare system, allow me a few points of rebuttal. Firstly, Barrett told us that the only job of doctors is to sell the credibility of their advice, ignoring a big part of what doctors are supposed to do. Yes, consultation is part of what a doctor is supposed to do, but beyond that, it also extends to more often than not your diagnosis, your prescription of drugs. These are all important factors by a doctor that does does not change when you tell them regardless of where you smoke. Because like it or not, even if I smoke or don't smoke, the way I'm going to diagnose you is still going to be the same. The type of drugs that I'm going to prescribe to you is still going to be the same. So we don't see how it's going to affect the quality of the lifestyle or the healthcare that they're going to talk to you about. Secondly, they say it's going to be less persuasive and less accountable because the patients don't trust the doctors anymore. For your system of trust to be established, you need to have a long-term exposure of these patients towards the lifestyle of these doctors. As far as I know, without this form of policy that you're going to implement now, patients don't even know what are the lifestyles of this doctor. Before that, they still very much trust the doctors because of very objective standards of how they rate the doctors, the effectiveness of the treatment, how much they trust the doctor, and the credibility of that. You put an arbitrary yardstick because now you put a non-performance index onto them to say that you can now judge people on how fat they are. You can judge them based on how black the fingernails are because they smoke. These are all very non-related to medical issues that you are putting on them, and we believe it's an unfair burden that you're putting on them. Thirdly, Barrett told us that they want to promote consumer choice and therefore they should allow it. But what form of consumer choice and freedom of choice is there when you have the whole medical fraternity condemning a doctor for his personal lifestyle, which has nothing to do with what the pillars of medical ethics is? This is exactly what they want to talk to you about, because the medical pillar of principles does not extend to your personal life. It extends towards a professional life and ethics as a doctor, or whether or not you are going to treat this person. Your Hippocratic oath has nothing to do with how your personal lifestyle is. That means, as a doctor, you can screw as many girls as you want, but it has nothing to do with how well you treat a patient, when you don't believe they should be penalized based on that. Sit down, I'll take it in a while. But lastly, they say, well, now you normalize the lifestyle as if the patients are so stupid and they can only do it because the doctors are doing it. Number one, we argue to you, if a patient wants to smoke or do this more unhealthy lifestyle, chances are there is a whole wide list of influence out there that extends to beyond what doctors are. Their family member, your celebrity, and your popular culture also promotes this form of unhealthy lifestyle. But if you're so easily influenced by a doctor's, chances are you're probably going to be easily influenced by all these things I've talked to you about. Secondly, it's not like they already hang out with this doctor that we talked to you. But thirdly, these doctors, at the end, they still do not forgo their own obligations because they still tell you that smoking is bad. They still tell you that these are choices that you must make and you must judge for yourself. So on and so forth, as the doctor don't tell you that it's okay to smoke, but they tell you that it's my personal choice to smoke and you shouldn't follow it. Then we believe that the role of the doctor is still intact, and we believe that their integrity is still there. The government outcome is simple, right? We believe that number one, they have to show us how the treatment is going to be affected. But number two, why is it the obligation of doctors to change the lifestyle? Because we say in status quo also, you can prescribe the drugs for your patients to eat, but whether or not your patients decide to take those medication is something that you cannot control. You cannot go on and actually follow them 24/7 to ensure they take those meds. Your obligation extends so on and so forth as to tell them what disease they're having and what meds they should take and why they should take those meds. Sit down, I'll take it in a while. Firstly, let me move on to my point on the duty and obligation of doctors and medical practitioners. I'll take it in a while, Gemma. Wait. Provide treatment and immediate utility. You have to understand the role of doctor is what I've told you so far. It's to diagnose, it's to dispense drug, and it's to apply their information and disseminate those information towards you. That means their role extends so far as to educate you that smoking is bad, but their role does not extend to making sure that you stop smoking entirely, because your obligation is simply that the health of your patient is protected within the scope of your duty. That means you can just tell them what healthy choices are, but you cannot make those choices on their behalf, because in status quo, we also allow them to take choices on whether or not they want to take those, whether or not they want to opt into the surgeries that we tell you that you should take. Sit down. You place unnecessary social yardstick on them because it's a false perception that the aesthetics of a doctor is also a yardstick that you can measure the performance on. You discredit good doctors that perhaps opt into this more unhealthy lifestyle because of how dedicated they are to their job. More often than not, side government may not want you to believe this, but the extra burden that you incur from working overshift and working 36 hours is directly what caused them to actually take on smoking as a way of stress relief, to eat unhealthily because they have no chance to actually get a proper meal. You don't believe now that it's fair for them to judge the doctors based on these kind of things, because you can see the parallel in other form of occupation as well. You can be a coach, you can be as fat as what you want, but as long as you provide healthy advice to the people, then it's fine. If the athletes still listen to you regardless of whether or not you're fat, then we don't believe it's the role of the state or the medical fraternity, which are not, by the way, explained by them, to condemn these people. The healthy lifestyles are just ideals. Go.
Not every priest is a pedophile, but the church is held responsible. There's a significant reduction in people showing up at church because of one person who is eventually found.
The question here is it a doctor's responsibility to ensure that you are more likely to take up this advice as a result of better reputation of the medical profession, or should they just not give a fuck about what you're going to do with that advice?
No, you have to understand that religion is a separate debate because these are not things that the religion can directly affect the treatment. You have to understand when it comes to doctors, there's a form of immediate outcome that you have to see. Church is a very arbitrary thing which you cannot influence the choice of lifestyle of your people. Even the church, they can condemn these pedophiles, but they cannot do anything to ensure that they don't end up as pedophiles. But let's move on into my point right on how it affects the equilibrium of allocation in healthcare. People will now choose doctors based on selective trade system that they are placed onto them. That means more often than not, your healthy doctors now who look healthy will be swarmed and it will affect their performance even more. Because as you know, doctors are already overwhelmed by the work. You shift the equilibrium now towards this form of people, and there are only so few doctors in there. Therefore, you affect the performance of what the doctors might give to the patients because they are overworked. They are being placed as the ideal doctors where other doctors are actually doing much better job or even the equal job just because they look fat. You're condemning them based on that. We don't believe it's a yardstick that you should place on. Site government must show us how it affects the outcome of the treatment. We're very proud to propose.
Let me step you through side opposition's analysis. They say a doctor cannot guarantee that you will take up their advice, that you will indeed take the drugs that you're prescribed. So all they ought to do is tell you something or give you something, and that is the end of their role. As if the medical profession isn't aimed at actually making you healthier. We believe it is. We believe the role of a doctor is to attempt to convince you to follow medical advice, not to offer you medical advice and then be absolutely uncaring as to whether or not you actually act upon that advice. We would suggest the aim of having a medical profession where governments invest hundreds of millions of dollars into training doctors and into researching drugs is for you to actually go to those doctors, actually listen to that advice, and probably actually take those drugs so that you don't die prematurely. So, in a world in which we agree with their analysis that you as a doctor cannot force a patient to follow your advice, you cannot follow them home, you cannot take the cigarettes out of their bag, you cannot force pills down their throat, how do we increase the likelihood that you will self-opt into following that advice or into taking those pills or into believing or listening to that diagnosis? The way we do it is by ensuring that you have faith in the person who gives you that advice in the first place, in the diagnosis that they make. So the suggestion that the perception of doctors is inconsequential in this debate is absolutely wrong. And this was really obviously evidenced by the complete failure of Patrick to respond to that point of information, where he said, oh, religion is different. That is a different thing, and therefore it is not analogous. It is indeed analogous, because what religion is selling you, given you as an individual cannot interrogate the factual accuracy of the claims of religion, is faith. In order for you to have faith in what a priest tells you, you have to believe in the priest. You have to trust that that person, in fact, does speak to you on behalf of God. And we would say that a very similar relationship exists between doctors and patients. And here's where I'm going to provide some additional analysis to bear at. The reason is because you as a patient cannot evaluate the claims of a doctor on the basis of facts. There is a huge information asymmetry. They have a medical degree, and you as an average reasonable person cannot interrogate whether or not their diagnosis is in fact accurate. That is very hard for you to do because you don't have access to the scientific understanding of what they are telling you to do. And therefore, because you cannot evaluate the facts of the situation, you have to believe them because you trust them as a person and as a representative of an institution, which is the medical profession at large. And that's the reason why we do things like, for example, have ethics that we force doctors to, for example, live by. That's why we force doctors not to do things like have relationships with their patients. It's not because it changes the diagnosis that they give to that patient. It's because for them to do that actually undermines the credibility of the profession at large, which means people are less likely to actually go to that doctor in the first place. And that's true even if it's not that individual doctor who did the wrong thing. And this is what they missed wholeheartedly in this case. So let me deal with the really low-level analysis we get that says, but how would you know because you only see them for 10 minutes? Like, if that's going to be the major claim of your case, you're really in trouble. The first thing I would say is, overwhelmingly, people's engagement with doctors is longer than 10 minutes because many people who are sick don't simply go to the GP and then walk out. They might need to, for example, go multiple times to a doctor. They might need to go to specialists. They might need to be hospitalized and therefore actually associate with doctor for a long period of time. They might have an OBGYN or someone provides them chemotherapy. The suggestion that you've only ever seen or met your doctor for 10 minutes, false. Secondly, It is also true that people know doctors outside of actual medical engagements, as Farah told you. So you're not just making an assessment of the doctor in front of you at that moment. You're making an assessment of the profession as a whole. And if you have seen doctors in their private life go about things that would be actively against medical advice, then why is it that you wouldn't presume the person in front of you is also doing that same thing? So for a team that said, all we give a shit about is people walking in the door and hearing the information and getting the diagnosis, I'm not convinced you're going to get them to walk in the door in the first place. That's the point. And let me give you an extreme example, but I think one that's relevant nonetheless. The reason why during the recent Ebola outbreaks in Africa, people didn't even show up to the doctor in the first place was not because they made an evaluation of the actual diagnosis they were offered. It was because they didn't have faith in the institution of Western medicine because of previous unethical behavior that had nothing to do with the individual diagnosis they offered in the case of Ebola. The suggestion that the actual perception of the profession is inconsequential in this debate is wrong. The religion analogy is actually pertinent and they should engage with it. But another analogy I'd provide to you is why is it that we punish sports people who do things like behave unethically off the field? Me punching someone in a bar doesn't change whether or not I can actually play football or run fast. The reason we punish you is because it brings your profession into disrepute. It means you as a role model, somebody who has a position of authority in society, is more likely to normalize that behavior. It means that your club bears the cost of the reputational damage that your individual lifestyle choice has taken. And we think this is an accepted principle. It is absolutely untrue to say that your own personal health is inconsequential to your capacity as a doctor to make people believe that the advice you give is legitimate and in fact representative of reality. So we would say that in terms of consequences, the outcome of our policy is that the institution in general has more faith and more subscription. We think that leads to a healthier society. We think it is absolutely, as they said, difficult to stop smoking. We would like to increase the likelihood that people do it. Go ahead.
If people currently distrust the doctors, they can simply walk away or go to another doctor. Why do you need the extra?
Okay, well, for a start, as you said, in certain cases they might not be able to evaluate the individual doctor, and we think that amounts to lying to them. So in the instance where, for example, you as a doctor are saying, bro, I really think, for example, you should take these antibiotics because it would be best for you, and that person individually doesn't believe in taking antibiotics when they're sick, you might not be able to assess that. Just because you can't assess it doesn't mean it's okay. We think that's actually lying to consumers. So the suggestion that the medical board or other doctors don't have an incentive to ensure consumers can make an accurate choice and believe in the doctor that they go to is actually wrong. Finally, I want to add another addition on the morality front because we think it's actively immoral for doctors who understand the consequences of their bad behavior to engage in this behavior at all. Why is that the case? Because if you're an alcoholic doctor and you know that if the outcome of you getting cirrhosis of the liver is that you're going to need a liver transplant, and you know because you're a doctor that those are in short supply, and in all likelihood you getting a liver transplant means somebody else doesn't get access to a liver and they die, we think that is immoral. We think that makes you a bad person, and we think you ought to act differently. We think that that is reason enough to censure doctors who behave badly because they understand the consequence more than any other person in society as a whole. We think that's absolutely true. Let's deal with the doctors who aren't bad people, the doctors who work long hours, the doctors who smoke because they're stressed by being a doctor. We think the outcome of this policy is to change the focus of the medical profession. Because when the American Medical Association stands up and says you as a doctor should prioritize being healthy, you should eat well, you shouldn't sleep never. If you're a psychologist, you should try to avoid becoming mentally ill because you spend so much time at work that you never see your friends and family. We think that might actually change the orientation of the profession in general and make it more accommodating to, for example, not working people overtime. For example, letting doctors sleep so they don't do things like accidentally leave needles in people and other malpractice because they're actually overworked. If it is true that people make decisions on the basis of problems in the profession, this is something that will actually be a wake-up call to people who run that profession to let those people go early so they can actually cook a meal at home. We think it's unethical for people to behave this way. We think it lies to consumers, and we think ultimately the outcomes of our policy are to make everybody healthier. Doctors, society, we win the debate.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister for your speech. Call PP that.
We would argue from side opposition that the only thing this proposal does is to create new forms of distrust where people initially were okay with the doctors, where people initially trust the doctors. This is the exact kind of policy that creates distrust, and if you argue that distrust is bad, then your policy is definitely bad. A few rebuttals. Firstly, if I don't know. If I know the lifestyle of the doctor, I'm less likely to trust the doctors that give me advice because his advice is no longer credible when I find out that he smokes. So let's look into this. Really, let's examine how far does the extent or the influence of the doctor's lifestyle affect my personal choice. Firstly, if I know that this doctor smokes and I distrust him and I in status quo don't want this doctor to treat me because I see his advice as uncredible, why would I still stay on and go back to this doctor who I don't trust that is able to give me sound advice, something that concerns my personal well-being and my livelihood? Those things simply doesn't make sense. So in status quo, for the people who already distrust the doctor, there's an avenue for them to simply opt out or go away from doctors and go to doctors who look healthy, right? So it doesn't affect them. But the people who stay on with these doctors, unhealthy looking doctors, maybe they have some stains on their teeth or on their nails that tells you that they smoke, probably they don't care whether these doctors smoke or not, which means there is no problem and no issue of distrust. Either that, or maybe they care, but they simply don't know. They can't tell whether these doctors are practicing unhealthy lifestyles. Things such as drinking and smoking, maybe you can tell from the smell, or maybe you can tell if they're having a hangover. But things such as consuming high sodium diet, such as a high fat diet, high sugar diet, and people don't work out and leading to them being very unhealthy, having very low muscle mass, all these things are still unhealthy but won't be available and won't be accessible by the average patient anyway. Which means even though you can't assess, like, right, this is where Gemma said, yeah, sometimes people can't assess whether the doctor is healthy or not, but that doesn't mean it's not a problem. But that it does mean it's not a problem, because if you're unable to assess whether the doctor is healthy or not, then your issue of distrust will never have exist, because the whole premise of distrust is you knowing that the doctor is unhealthy. So there's no point in your solution, right? Sit down. So let's look at really the change, the creation, what this policy really brings about. If you start openly condemning doctors, pulling them out, identifying these doctors and telling people these are the people that are practicing unhealthy lifestyle, and we as a medical fraternity will officially condemn them, that is where you send out the official message telling everyone that doctors who are unhealthy themselves are uncredible, like a bad sources of medical advice, which means people who initially trust these doctors will not trust them, and that is very harmful, because if these people are going to take their advice and their compliance to the healthy lifestyle is based on the number of healthy doctors out there in the market, then it's a very dire situation for us all, because a healthy lifestyle is indeed a very, very high yardstick for everyone to achieve. But let's look at, I'll take you in a while, let's look at the priest analogy. You need to have faith in the person that gives you the instruction. But firstly, we look to priests as examples. We don't look to doctors as examples. We look to them for solutions. I look to my doctor for my medication and to perform surgery. But more importantly, when it comes to theology and morality, there's often no overwhelming consensus, which means my sole base and sole source of knowledge is my priest. That's why I need to trust him. But when they talk about issues of everything that has medical consensus, that means I don't rely on my doctor for that information. The whole world out there is telling me that smoking is bad. So how important is the role of the doctor really? So even if I don't trust my doctor, it doesn't matter, because he's not my sole source of information. He's not my source of role model. I only need to get my information elsewhere. I only need to get my medication from my doctor. Simple as that. Yes.
Okay, I spent a lot of time in my speech that tells you that if you have a doctor friend who smokes, that would make you reluctant to not to smoke, and that normalizes the behavior. Can you tell us why that kind of trust is a good thing and something that you should promote?
No, if I am so susceptible to my friend leading an unhealthy lifestyle, then it doesn't matter if my friend is a doctor or a lawyer or a politician. For goodness sake, he can be a priest and be still smoking. By that logic, we should ban everyone in a credible profession to stop lead unhealthy lifestyle, right? So that really doesn't make sense. If you're so easily influenced, like what Patrick has already told you, if you're so easily influenced by one person's behavior, you're probably also very easily influenced by the vast sources of information that already empower you to make that decision by yourself. So the only outcome here is you create additional distrust, right? So let's also talk about why it's a bit unfair to impose these kinds of burdens onto the doctor. No, thank you. We already told you, right, that Patrick briefly mentioned this, but I'm gonna mention it again. So, doctors in status quo already have a lot of stress on them because of the high burden and the high requirements of their job. No, thank you. Which means they're often overworked, which means there's already an immense pressure on them in terms of making medical decisions, making moral decisions on who do I treat, how do I treat them, and these forms of pressure are added onto them every single day. And those kinds of expectations are okay in a sense because it directly concerns their performance in helping the patients recover. But when it comes to lifestyle choices, where most probably your patients don't even know how your lifestyle is, then it shouldn't come into the sphere of assessing the professional capacity of a doctor, because the outcome, when tried to conflate the private and professional lives of doctors, and you send the message out to everyone that the credible doctors are only the ones that are healthy, the first outcome is that there will be very few doctors left out there that is credible. Because if you want to look at a healthy lifestyle, that includes exercising, half an hour every day, that includes a high fiber, low sodium, low fat, low sugar diet, which is very inaccessible to doctors who are working 36-hour shifts, which means a lot of people will be swamping to healthy-looking doctors or doctors who are labeled as healthy by the medical fraternity, and these doctors who choose to lead a healthy lifestyle will be overswamped because of the overwhelming demand of their skills, which means even these healthy doctors eventually will be pushed to the extent where they have to go into adopting unhealthy lifestyle, such as smoking, such as eating unhealthily to cope with the workload and the stress. The medical profession is already overtasked. Let's not conflate their private and professional lives. We're very proud to oppose.
If I'm trying to build a house myself, and my friend is a structural engineer, and I ask him, what do I need? And he says, beams, 10 kilos of cement, and whatever number of bricks. But I turn around and look at the house building, and he's not using beams. I'll probably not listen to that advice and not use beams instead, because it's probably a lot cheaper to do so. Those are the outcomes that we're looking at. An absence or a reduction in the amount of trust that individuals would have, not with that specific doctor and that particular relationship, but with the medical profession as a whole. What they fail to engage with is the fact that when a doctor willingly takes actions towards having an unhealthy lifestyle, they are willingly, with full understanding of the medical consequences and the intricacies of the medical outcomes, making this decision willfully. And that's exactly the rationale by which we, as non-medical individuals, evaluate the person. Because I know smoking is bad, but a doctor knows exactly what happens when you smoke, including what happens to your lungs, and the fact that you might in the future need a lung transplant. You can tell me as much about that as you might want as a doctor, but I'll still have some degree of doubt in your information just because there is information asymmetry and I'm never actually able to comprehend what you're telling me. So in the instance where the only thing left to ensure that a patient has no doubt in the information and advice you provide them, the trust and credibility that the profession has, we think then that as a body that is responsible for the reputation of medicine, you are then responsible for ensuring that this reputation is managed and not gone down the drain. Let's analyze a couple of things that have happened in this debate. The first thing we told you from our side is the fact that doctors sell credibility and trust. Their response was no. People don't care about credibility and trust, and perception is unimportant at all. Yet Deborah in her speech tells you midway through and towards the end that if we do institute this policy, people will run away from doctors because perception matters. So they've got to make up their mind as to whether perception matters or not. We tell you it actually does, because perception is what fuels the medical industry. That's why when scandals occur, there's a need to respond to them in the first place. When Gemma spoke to you of the examples of individuals who inappropriately touch their patients or have relationships with them, the reason why we ban this is because of a fear of an outbreak. What they failed to engage with is, in the instance where there is a societal understanding or outbreak of information about, say, a group of psychologists who failed to maintain their mental health in a certain part of the world, all the psychologists around the world would be impacted because it's a matter of reputation at the end of the day. And that's an unhealthy lifestyle, being an individual who leads yourself towards depression, and that's how it becomes problematic for the profession. So in a profession where at the end of the day, trust is paramount, we find it problematic. Now, what else have they failed to engage with? Behrat told you in his speech, and Gemma reiterated this, that when a doctor practices certain activities, it essentially results in a process of normalization. What does that mean? That means that ultimately, when a doctor continues to practice a certain behavior, it allows for individuals to point to a doctor and say, doctors who are fully aware of the consequences are doing this, and therefore it should be okay for me as a layman to continue to do this. We think that from a moral point of view, a doctor should not be contributing to this process. A doctor should not be complicit in the process of propagating individuals practicing activities that are unhealthy. There are two scenarios when this happens. The first scenario is where you're engaging with a doctor whom you know is a doctor, and we tell you that's problematic on the face because that also affects reputation. But on the second one, which is what Gemma uniquely brought to you, is morally, from a moral point of view, as an individual who's fully aware of the consequences, even when people don't know you're a doctor, you're part and parcel of that influence they spoke to you that is outside the medical industry of why individuals make certain decisions. So if I'm a doctor and I willingly walk into a bar, drink my ass off, look like a retard, and endorse that activity as a person, period, that's itself morally abhorrent intrinsically, because you're an individual who's tasked in propagating positive values of a healthy lifestyle, because ultimately the purpose of the medical industry is to ensure that you end up a healthy person, or at least reduce the likelihood of you not actually falling. But let's understand another problem that they've also failed to engage with. We told you in Gemma's speech that the solution to their biggest problem, which is that it's unfair to doctors because they're all stressed out, is this. Maybe if there was some sort of public discourse on what doctors end up doing, i.e. participating in activities that would otherwise be perceived as abhorrent for a doctor to conduct, maybe then there would be a discussion about how the medical industry could improve itself. Maybe then a doctor could find low GI, low sodium food in the kitchenette or pantry that's provided within that hospital before moving on and before.
Well, if you want to improve doctors' practice, why can't you just end campaign on improving doctors' practice?
Sure, we can do that, but why can't we do this? Why can't we as a medical association that necessarily doesn't have full control over hospitals and employers who employ doctors at the end of the day to go out there and say it is wrong for a doctor to be unhealthy, and perception gets affected. Yes, maybe some doctors will actually lose business, but maybe that's the incentive for them to actually take action. Maybe the fact that a hospital loses patients because their doctors are unhealthy is the reason why that hospital takes steps towards ensuring that the lives of those doctors are not unhealthy, i.e. by managing their time, providing them a gym on site, providing better food, etc., etc., etc. So their primary ideas were as follows. Distrust already exists in society, but perception doesn't matter. But perception matters if you impose your policy. We're not sure where they stand on this matter. Where we stand is ultimately that perception is the peak of the medical industry, and distrust will continue to exist if we don't make a stance on it. But more importantly, it is a lot easier to dissociate ourselves from medical scandals when we already have a precedent of explicitly stating we are against such behavior, rather than being dragged down to the mud as a profession as a result of the activities of certain people. Lastly, they tell you that priests are different because there's an asymmetry of knowledge and religion is special. We tell you the medical industry is like religion, because WebMD is not enough for you to understand the full consequences of what happens to you when you do certain things. Where there is a significant amount of trust is where information asymmetry exists. And the medical profession, the medical industry, is very difficult to comprehend, much like religion. That's why it's based on trust. And that's why we should uphold doctors to the same standard they're okay upholding priests to.
Mr. Speaker, I have three main issues for today's debate. Firstly, what influences the lifestyle choice of individuals? Secondly, can you lead an unhealthy lifestyle and still be a good doctor? And last but not least, this issue of trust and credibility. Let's look at the first issue of what influences the lifestyle choices of individuals. I don't know about you, Mr. Speaker, but as for a reasonable, average individual, I don't picture whether my doctor is fat or healthy or skinny or smokes or not before I go for a workout. I don't picture whether or not my doctor smokes or not, or drinks 7 glasses of water a day before I decide on my diet scheme. We think that kind of correlation that existed on the side of government never took place in today's debate. Prime Minister told us that, look, it causes the normalization of bad habits, but just because my doctor, my GP smokes, does not mean that I as a patient will directly smoke. We think that even the dumbest bloke on earth will be able to reason out that smoking and alcohol addiction is bad in general. Why? Because that is just on grounds of common sense. We think that the government has missed this entirely. No thank you. But this is the clincher for today, because even if we assume on their best case scenario that doctors do in fact live these perfect lifestyles of exercising 5 times a week, 8 glasses of water a day, there is no direct link to show that all these patients will be able to emulate those perfect lifestyles that you so seek to promote. Because at the end of the day, it's about individual choice. It's about the capability of these individuals to garner or to decide what kind of diet they choose to seek. Because at the end of it all, no thank you, maybe later on, this is the clincher, right? Because there are different factors that shapes an individual's lifestyle. For instance, the access to information, healthcare campaigns, for instance, social norms, and more importantly, personal choices. It has never in any paradigm been about the lifestyle choices of doctors, and they've never shown us either how that transcends, how there is a direct link that causes that the lifestyle of doctors would transcend to their own. Therefore, we think that case false. Second issue, can you lead an unhealthy lifestyle and still be a good, legitimate doctor? In the very get-go, the government told that, look, this goes against the pillars and the principles of healthcare because you should always follow your own advice. It's the you should practice what you preach kind of doctrine. But we think it really doesn't matter so long as these doctors fulfill their job scope and their obligation. And it is as simple as being able to diagnose, it's as simple as being able to dispense the correct drug. And we think on those grounds, so long as you are able to apply your medical knowledge that you learned for the 5 years and during your time as during housemanship, we think that is sufficient grounds. It is bad enough that there are so many measures in which we gauge a doctor. The stress that comes during surgery, the stress that comes when you are expected as a doctor to dispense the correct medication and the correct diagnosis is sufficient grounds already to overburden the doctors that we have in status quo. We think on the side, we told you, no thank you, we told you in Patrick's speech that this overburden doctors when you have a non-performance yardstick in gauging the quality of doctors that is extremely harmful towards the overall credibility of the healthcare institution, which is exactly the point they brought up to us. Because at the end of it all, the legitimacy and the efficacy of the treatment should be the sole yardstick in which we gauge the credibility and the legitimacy of doctors. And we don't think it should extend to their lifestyle choices, because now you put even private clinics or public hospitals in a dilemma. Now they'll have to gauge not just the legitimacy or how good you are as a medical profession. Now you also need to gauge the lifestyle choices, and we think that creates a very false dichotomy as to how medical clinics or how institutions or hospitals gauge or select their doctors. We think, especially when life is at stake, you should never gauge, you should never use non-performance yardsticks as your ultimate gauge of quality. But before I go on, yes sir.
Part of a doctor's job is to push your personal choice towards what's good for you, which is being healthy, because otherwise you're bad for the healthcare system. Why is it morally acceptable for a doctor to make choices that make that doctor a burden on the very medical system that they understand very well and understand the cost behind?
It's the same reason why that if you are a doctor, we still do not discriminate you and we still treat you, because we understand that you are also an individual. You are also a human who can fall short of those great ideals of having to exercise 5 times a week. It's the same reason why we do not have prejudice against refugees or prejudice against the color of your skin or what language you speak prior to giving you medication. We think it's on those same grounds that we do not penalize doctors who fall short of those ideals. I'm very proud to stand by this ideal. But look, the government told us endlessly on this analogy of a priest that if you are a pedophile and you violate the holy word of God, that your congregation will lose faith in you, and how there's a parallel with the medical profession. Firstly, we think in those cases where there is direct molestation or when a doctor has sexual relation with a patient, under standard SOP or under law, right, is an outright violation of the law, and we are okay with punishing those people, and we are okay with condemning them because we believe that they deserve that condemnation. But on what grounds then, no thank you, we need to now question ourselves. On what grounds then do we gauge the credibility, or on what grounds do we discredit and fire doctors? We think, yes, if there is a sexual relation that the doctor had with the patient, yes, we're okay, fire him, that he had violated the law. But we don't think just because you are unable to exercise 5 times a day because you've been serving patients for 36 hour shift, that you would gauge those same principles and ban them altogether. We think those are not legitimate grounds at all. But what are the harms that we've told you consistently from the opposition bench? No thank you, I'm not taking any more. The first harm, we told you in a context where there is a scarcity of doctors, we need as much help as is possible. Secondly, we told you that under the government's case, you would systematically stream out even good doctors who are knowledgeable, who are able to give out accurate dispensing and diagnosis. We think you lose those paradigms, those limited few good doctors that we already have, just on the grounds because you think they are fat, just because you have these arbitrary yardsticks that they are not living healthy lifestyles. We think it's extremely volatile. But thirdly, we think you skew away from the ability to gauge what is truly a legitimate medical quality now that you have a false dichotomy. But that leads me to my last point on this idea of trust and credibility. Mr. Speaker, at the end of it all, it boils down to this, right? Yes, there'll be 2 groups of people. Firstly, people in which they don't care about this element of perception, right? That they would just consult the doctor anyway. But secondly, there are those who would still be subjected to this idea of perception. Meaning to say, when you publicly condemn these good doctors, you lose the element of trust between patient and doctor, and we think that it's extremely volatile, and you destroy the entire institution of the healthcare of the hospitals as well. For all these reasons, I'm extremely proud to protect doctors.
I'll talk about perception, profession, and principles. Firstly, let's look at if perception matters. Let's look at the impact of their policy. And I think I made it pretty clear in my speech. And there were some red herring attempts coming out, but let me clear it again. The only impact that you have, this policy, is you create new distrust that weren't existing before. Because if people distrust doctors anyway, they can simply walk away. You create that form of distrust only when you start naming and shaming doctors, telling people these are unhealthy doctors, that they're not credible sources of medical advice. Then, people who initially didn't have an issue with these doctors will have a distrust. And if distrust on their characterization means distrust means that you won't follow advice of your doctors, then that's bad for everyone, because there will be a lot of doctors out there who are untrustworthy, which means there will be a lot of people, according to their characterization, won't be following doctor advisors. But let's look at whether perception, yes, perception matters or not, right? So if perception really affects people a lot, then you create more distrust, then that's bad. But if perception doesn't matter, and this is where I answer Mustafa's question, apparently he's a bit confused, so it's an even if scenario. Either way, your case doesn't work. If perception matters a lot, you create new form of distrust, which is bad. If perception doesn't matter, then there's no point to your case. Thirdly, let's look at the dependency of patients on doctors in deciding their lifestyle choices. Most people don't base their lifestyle decisions, such as whether I smoke, whether I work out, what I eat, on their doctor's behavior, because most of us don't even visit doctors that much. When we do, we don't spend a lot of time. Maybe they do in other parts of the world, but in Malaysia, no, we don't get that luxury, and like in a lot of parts of the world, we don't do that anyway. So, like, when we make decisions, most people don't rely on their doctors and don't how their doctors behave anyway, because according to their characterization, these lifestyle choices have a medical consensus, and we think it's overwhelmingly clear that the world tells you, even like my 7-year-old nephew knows, that smoking is bad, that drinking is bad. So these things, you don't need to depend on the doctor. But let's take them at their best case scenarios. Look at the words that they use. What if there is someone with a friend? If I have a friend that has a doctor that smokes, that boils down to very, very selective cases, these very minority group of people who base their lifestyle decisions on their doctor's lifestyle choices. So if we care about these people, and this huge policy of condemning thousands and thousands of doctors is solely put to protect this small group of people, then we think it's a bit disproportionate, right? Because what is the outcome? Let's look at profession. Not only do you create a new form of distrust, right? You also create the overburdening on the system. When we talk to the analysis, where people will not only go to doctors who are labeled and certified as healthy, creating an overtax and an overburden onto these doctors themselves. And we think that form of analysis wasn't really rebutted, except they talk about if you want to improve medical practices, maybe we should highlight that these doctors are very unhealthy. But you can already do that with a direct campaign that says doctors are being mistreated. You don't have to go like a big round and say doctors are horrible, they're unhealthy, like uncredible sources of information. Really doesn't solve anything. But lastly, the moral obligation of the medical fraternity. Firstly, your moral obligation only extends insofar as the doctor's influence onto patients, and we already discounted that to a large extent. But the moral also has to be allowing people to make their own informed choices. When they already have all the information about what they can and cannot do, what's good or bad for them, we don't need to go the further step to condemn doctors, because that's bad.
The fear-mongering of the opposition was largely based on a misunderstanding of what it meant to censure, what it meant for the American Medical Association or the American Psychological Association to publicly decry doctors who themselves are unhealthy. It didn't mean we were going to fire fat doctors. It didn't mean there was going to be a certificate on the door that said, this doctor, known unhealthy, do not go here. And it certainly didn't mean we were going to refuse them a liver transplant if they were an alcoholic. It meant we, as a society and as a peak body who is responsible for the medical profession, ought to take a stance on what is right or wrong. So at the end of this debate, it was the job of all of you to assess whether or not the behavior of these doctors was right or wrong. Let me take you on a journey through the speeches we hear on the opposition. Speech number 1, we hear, perception doesn't matter, and being a good doctor is as simple as correctly diagnosing somebody and offering them a drug. That's it, you've met the standard. Which seemed kind of strange at the point at which they accepted that things like engaging in a relationship with your patient is something they were happy to be against the law. And continuously Sarah saying, well, it's against the law, and that's the reason why it's against the law, wasn't a compelling argument. They needed to explain or engage with the fact that medical ethics are not related to your capacity to diagnose a patient or to give them a drug. They're related to your capacity to be a professional that is respected within the fields. Given they considered medical ethics were important, even from speech 1, problematic. Speech 2, we hear, actually, perception is important, but it's likely to become worse under your policy because now we've told people that doctors are unhealthy when they didn't otherwise know. Problem with that analysis is obvious. A, we told you people already know because they see it on a day-to-day basis. They don't have to see their own individual doctor smoking. They just have to understand and live in a society where they see people in the medical professional acting improperly right now. That was a true reality right now. So we thought the best way to re-establish credibility in a world in which people were already skeptical was for the peak body who makes decisions about medical ethics to come out and take a stance and say that it would prefer doctors not act in that way, and it will take actions to discourage doctors from acting in that way. We thought in a world in which there was already skepticism, the only way you could actually rectify that situation was to acknowledge the reason people were skeptical and attempt to redress it. Run their counter policy in Deb's speech, which was to lie to patients and pretend as though doctors didn't do the wrong thing. We told you that was completely unethical from the perspective of consumer choice. Speech number 3, we hear, life is all about personal choice, and actually if people want to smoke, they should do it irrespective of what a doctor says, which completely belied the reality of the existence of the medical profession and the fact that doctors attempted to encourage one choice over the other. For a team that said that all a doctor had to do was diagnose you correctly and offer you drugs, that was presumably a team that accepted at a certain point, we'd prefer you not to be sick, and the role of a doctor was to help you get healthy. So suggesting we didn't give a crap what people did as a result of doctors was inaccurate. 2 questions, in summary, after that completely incorrect case. First, was this right or wrong from an ethical perspective? We told you it is wrong for you to make a claim to a patient on the basis of your greater understanding of medical facts that you are then unwilling to follow through on, because it normalizes that behavior in society when you understand the consequences, and because even if it doesn't, even if it has no impact whatsoever on anyone's decision to see a doctor or to smoke or to become an alcoholic, you as a doctor were in a privileged position to understand that your own personal choices would harm someone else down the line. And here's where their analysis falls apart. They say doctors are under pressure, so they smoke and they drink, and that's okay. Except as a doctor, you understand that your short-term benefit of smoking or drinking will eventually lead to an unacceptable reliance upon a healthcare system, will potentially lead to you taking lungs or transplants or resources that could have been dedicated to your patients. And given you're in a privileged position to understand the cost of your own behavior, you ought not do it. Their only analysis there was to say, well, we can rectify the terrible things that doctors are forced to do by general public interest campaigns. What we tell you all the way through our case is the way that you give the AMA or private institutions an incentive to spend money to make doctors' lives better is you make their personal life an important part of their professional credibility. As long as the negative team wins in this debate and they say what you do in your personal life doesn't matter, then nobody would change. Doctors would be forced to work those long hours, and their lives and the lives of patients would be worse. That's why we took this debate.